realization that all the issues that I have worked on in global sustainability are getting worse and have gotten worse throughout all of my career, and somebody else is going to be the one to solve them. And I've told this story often, but it is true and it continues to move me. When I first met Hampshire students, I said, oh, they're the ones. So I'm here because I couldn't get it done, and I think this is the education for people who will. And I'm counting on them. And they haven't let me down yet. I think what I've been doing for the last 40 years is social change, but when I began thinking about it, as we discussed what we were going to say today, I became unsure. I've tried to change things, to particularly change policies, institutional behavior, and human behavior with respect to the environment for about 4 decades. First as a litigator. That seemed a really clear, simple strategy. Sue the bastards, right? Sue government agencies for not implementing the law, sue companies for breaking the law, sue groups for taking away the rights of others. And it just turns out that winning is not sufficient. Winning enables you to put a small dam in front of a stream, and it just seems like the water always finds its way around what you win in court. And then I tried regulation as a member of Marlene Gerber's cabinet in the state just north of here, where it was possible because we had basically a very honest amateur legislature and almost no money in politics to identify a problem, sit down with a group of legislators and discuss it and figure out what needed to be done, and pass a statute that seemed to get it done, and try to implement the statute and realize the stupendous misconceptions under which one was operating, and go back and fix the statute, all in the space of the 6 years that I was working for Marlene. And some of that worked pretty well. I'm proud of some of what we did. We passed about 13 statutes, but not much of it changed people's understanding of their world. Some of it changed institutional behavior. Some of it changed actual results. There's a lot less sewage going into mountain streams as a result. Garbage isn't being dumped in unlined landfills next to rivers, thus depriving people of a Saturday morning occasion when they could get together and exchange news with their neighbors, or a Friday evening occasion when they could drink beer and shoot rats. But the environmental results were okay. But I ended up pretty skeptical of starting with either regulation or litigation. And so what I wanted to talk about, I really will tell a couple of stories about trying to get at issues as an analyst, which is an interesting proposition, seems the furthest thing from an activist. So how can you be an activist analyst? How can you use information and ideas to make significant changes in institutional behavior? And the two stories that I'll tell pretty quickly reflect efforts to provide information that motivate groups of institutions to change behavior because it illustrates the extent to which it is in their long-term interest to change behavior. That's why I'm saying I was a little unsure of the definition of social change. I don't know, is it social change is sitting down with a group of companies within our broad definition, because both of these illustrations pick up on that option. The first involves greenhouse gases. The collection of 7 gases that contribute to global warming that we emit in massive quantities in the United States when we drive our cars, when we have cows graze in the fields, when we eliminate forests, but particularly when we operate power plants and large-scale industries. And my organization that I used to run, World Resources Institute, had been working on climate change since its founding in 1982. And we began to think about the question of if the world actually decides to manage the emission of greenhouse gases and reduce greenhouse gases, and if we eventually pick up on the success of regulation of sulfur dioxide in the United States that was based on market incentives, you would have to have a consistent way of measuring greenhouse gas emissions, okay? This is the wonkiest part of this. It won't get worse. That is, if we were going to set limits on emissions of gases that apply broadly across economies and globally, and if we were then going to allow sources of greenhouse gases to buy and sell and trade emission reductions, it would be really important for a ton to mean the same thing in New York and Beijing and London. And it turned out, as of 1995, 96, didn't, not remotely. So depending on your interests, you measured it differently at different places, included different things, and even described a molecule of CO2 differently. And so we set out to demonstrate that it was possible to create a consensus definition of greenhouse gas emissions. This, right? I mean, this is not complicated. Well, it is pretty complicated. And we figured that it was actually not very relevant to create a consensus among environmental organizations. That what we really wanted to do was to get a consensus among sources of emissions and to use the building of that consensus to have them learn something about how much it was in their interest to measure emissions, because we operated on the assumption that once the engineers measured emissions, they wouldn't be able to stop themselves from wanting to manage them. We manage what we measure, engineers particularly. Just, it would drive them crazy that they weren't figuring out the smartest way to operate if they were already measuring. So we set out in this process. Lots of arguments, lots of discussions internationally, about 100 companies involved, and agreed on basically the generally agreed on accounting principles for carbon. And we put them out there. The companies ran test runs of measuring their emissions and showing that it wasn't too expensive. And we thought that was the end of the process, that governments were going to say, yes, this is very important. We will together do something like this and create the officially accepted accounting principles for carbon. Wrong. Governments decided that this was actually pretty scary and might look like they were trying to regulate and they wanted to stay away from it. But the companies said, this is really interesting. It's a very good indicator of how well we're managing our energy use and our operations. Let's do more of this. Let's figure out how we can measure the emissions from our supply chain and from our transportation operations and ultimately from the use of our products. And we noticed that every company that got involved in measuring started managing. 100%. Every single one, the engineers couldn't keep their hands off it once it was measured. And part of the deal was they had to publicly report. So that protocol that was developed as a purely voluntary thing among a group of companies who agreed to do it so long as they weren't required to do anything has become the set of accounting principles that are used worldwide now. There are no arguments about how you measure carbon. People take it for granted. They take it for granted that you have to report according to these principles. You can't lie, right? It's really important on money. If companies could lie, then we can't really know how much money they're making. Well, if they can lie about carbon, we can't really know how much pollution they're making. We make bad policy. So I thought this was a stupendous success, frankly. It gave us entree to all kinds of companies, and I thought the step from this to regulating is really easy. Shouldn't be any problem at all, because these companies all now see that management is not so hard, that they can benefit from it, that it's better for them to have predictable outcomes and certain management and to have their competitors have to do the same than it is to operate in the Wild West, no regulation. That was all true till the Tea Party. I won't follow this story through to the end. That struck me as social change. Required analytical excellence to do the basic stuff about how would you measure it. It required giving people a safe place where they could convene around a problem, and it required having the patience to have them discover why it was in their interest to move. That is, there were no bludgeons used, except the bludgeon of prospective change in the future that might be expensive. One other similar, am I still within time?
You're fine.
Okay.
I gave you an hour.
One other similar story. This one's one of my favorites because it involves ladies' hats. Estimates are that 60 to 80% of the wood harvested worldwide is harvested illegally. That is, it is not harvested consistent with the rules of the country where it is being harvested. The people who should benefit economically from it, or the governments that should benefit economically, don't. Environmental standards, whatever they are in that country, are not observed. That's a big problem environmentally, right? It's leading to destruction of forest and the ecosystems in the forest. It is a problem socially because the people who should benefit are the people who live in and off those forests, and they don't. This is theft on a very, very, very large scale. And of course, the trees store carbon. And whenever we get around to really getting serious about reducing emissions, we'll have some system of transferring wealth from rich northern countries that pollute a lot to poor southern countries that don't, to get them to keep their forests standing because there's standing carbon. There are all kinds of moral issues in what I just said. I don't want to get into them. That's not what the story's about. But it seemed like a really big problem in that context that 60 to 80% of the wood harvested was being harvested illegally. Well, so you're going to transfer all this money and you continue to harvest 60 to 80% illegally. How's that going to work? I mean, you don't get the carbon savings, you don't get the social benefits, and so on. And that wood is all entering commerce, and in large part, we're the customers. So we became really interested in how you might address that problem. Now, there's all kinds of technology available that would help. If I had decided to use PowerPoint today, I could show you a PowerPoint in which we could track a single tree being illegally cut in Cameroon, hauled along a logging road that isn't supposed to exist to a French logging company that claims that it doesn't accept illegally harvested wood. I mean, this is the stuff they use for tracking Iraqi tanks in the desert or figuring out what the Iranians are up to. It can do logs. But what if nobody cared? right? I mean, that's the problem here. This is where the ladies' hats come in. I love this part of the story. I wish I could claim credit for this part of the story. At the turn of the century, Florida, South Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi were witnessing an unbelievable carnage of feathery waterfowl. Basically, out of work, aging Civil War veterans were going out and killing off waterfowl, ripping off the tail feathers or whatever decorative feathers were available, and sending them to New York and Boston to be made into ladies' hats because that was the style, and you had to have a lot of feathers. And it drove a bunch of people absolutely crazy, and one of them was Teddy Roosevelt. And Teddy Roosevelt made a deal with a conservative Republican congressman from Iowa, and they passed a statute that allowed the federal government to intervene if a wildlife product was shipped in interstate commerce that had been harvested illegally in the state of origin, right? So we can't get the corrupt SOBs in Florida to enforce their law, but when they try to ship it to New York, we nail them. And it worked pretty well. It was a great statute, not being used very much. Occasional bust of illegally harvested rockfish from the Chesapeake being taken to restaurants in New York and so forth. 100 years old, kind of out of date. And a brilliant young guy named Alexander von Bismarck, Sasha von Bismarck, came up with the idea of extending it to trees internationally. Now, he was crazy, except that all the logging and pulp and paper companies in the United States desperately wanted to find a way to stop the flow of cheap illegal wood from Indonesia and Papua New Guinea that was killing them. So they all backed this, and it passed and was signed by W. So suddenly, it was illegal to import a tree that had been harvested illegally in the country of origin. Now this is not imperialistic, right? We're not saying we're going to make you, Indonesia, do what we want you to do. We're just saying we're going to help you enforce your own laws, even though you're corrupt. And it put the burden on the importer and the end user to declare the species, the provenance, and the legality of the wood. Big, big deal, right? So as a former federal prosecutor, the burden has just shifted. If I can show that this is illegally harvested wood, I don't have to show that you knew it and intended to violate the law. You have to show that you took every possible step to avoid using illegally harvested wood. And so we wanted to set out to find some way to get the administration to bring a couple of enforcement cases, because we thought that would shake up the whole world of wood export. And we began using a combination of satellite data and economic tracking to try to basically put together a case wrapped up in a bow for the Justice Department so that they could take action on it, because they said, yeah, we might do that, but we can't assign any resources to this because we're trying to regulate Wall Street and the healthcare industry, and this isn't really very important. So in November of 2010, FBI agents arrived at the manufacturing facility of Gibson Guitar and busted them. Gibson Guitar was really interesting because Gibson Guitar proclaimed that they used nothing but FSC certified sustainably harvested wood. Their president was on the board of the most radical pro-tree organization. the Rainforest Action Coalition, and the FBI agents not only found illegal rosewood that couldn't be harvested anywhere in the world, but emails that just nailed them. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they were doing it because they wanted to get the wood. Which Marlene's told me to finish up, so I'm going to elide this a little bit. But it sent a scare throughout the supply chain because of the fear that some big company, was going to have a container ship full of wood arrive in the port of Los Angeles, and they were going to get busted. And if a company is subject to criminal sanctions, it's sort of the death penalty for them. At which point, we pulled together a coalition of companies to basically build a forest legality alliance. We said, okay, we don't want that to happen to you either. Let's all figure out how to make your suppliers supply you legal wood, and what kinds of technical information and tools we can supply you that enable you to force the Indonesian government to enforce its own law. And they're doing it. I really like that.
I just whispered to him that it didn't sound like a failure to me, but
right.
I think that's for a longer conversation. So I think let's see, what do I want to say? I came to Hampshire in 1986. I wasn't looking for Hampshire. This is sort of a theme, and not planned is really a serious matter. But Hampshire found me, and it's been sort of an amazing ride for me ever since. I did come as a political activist or a social change agent, or however you want to put it. I didn't have any question about that. For one thing, I go everywhere with propaganda, so that story tells you that I'm a political activist. But always from as an outlier. I am a creature, like many people of my generation, of the social movements of the 1960s, of the movement for racial justice, women's liberation, and the anti-Vietnam War movement. There's so many wars, you have to be specific what movement against what war you were in. So, and I was always in that, for example, in terms of the work that I do in reproductive rights here at Hampshire as the director and now the faculty director of the Civil Liberties and Public Policy program, and in outside of Hampshire working in the reproductive rights and justice movement. But since I had come to reproductive rights from working on civil rights and racial justice and with a more holistic left critique, I never saw reproductive rights or abortion as a single issue. I really did see it as a kind of holistic connection for me, it wasn't even just women's rights. It was that women's rights and reproductive rights were only realizable in a world of justice and equity. So, but I did this a lot against I think before I came to Hampshire, just so you know where I came from and how far I've had to travel and how much Hampshire to me was a refuge from a really very different kind of world. So and this somewhat goes back to the influences that you don't know are an influence. Because in many ways it's improbable to me how I ended up, I feel like the accidental activist. I certainly felt like the accidental interim president, which had more than moments of fear. All of these things had more than moments of fear. Now Jonathan knows that. He thought Washington was scary when he came to the faculty. But I'm a first generation college student. I came from a not political family, a Jewish family in Philadelphia. They were Democrats, but only because they understood, from their perspective, voting Democratic was good for the Jews. And I hope nobody will be offended by that. But they felt like that was an ally against anti-Semitism. At the same time, my mother, who would never, talk about herself as a feminist, but she was a businesswoman in the 1950s. She was the only mother on our street that actually worked outside the home. So she was for me a role model, although I certainly didn't know it at the time. Mostly we were in a lot of conflict about who was in charge of my life. I went to a public high school called the Philadelphia High School for Girls in Philadelphia, which it was, even though it sounds like it, it was not an institution for unwed mothers. But it was also, again, just one of these mixed up creatures. So it was racially integrated at a time when in Philadelphia the schools were not at all. We were encouraged to be leaders because, after all, we were the only people in the school who would be. But it was the Philadelphia High School for Girls. We were girls. And so we were receiving a lot of counter messages. The school next door was the school for males, but it wasn't called the Philadelphia High School for Boys. It was called Central High School. So there's a message there. We were also told while we were supposed to be leaders and doing everything, we weren't allowed to wear patent leather shoes to assembly. Does anyone know why? It reflects your underwear. Yes, exactly. So there you go. So, it's like this is the world of navigation. And then the last thing I'll say in this regard, and it's the only thing I remember from the convocation when I went as a freshman to Northwestern, the dean or whoever it was who was welcoming us said, he welcomed us and he said, you guys are here, you're going to find your careers, and you girls are here, you're going to find your husbands. And I did, but only briefly. I was a pretty rule-governed younger person, but then it came out. So, but I was really drawn in by the social movements of the 60s, but really only became an activist as a graduate student. So I was a little late bloomer coming to it, and I want to say that I was drawn to the activism. I was always drawn to street activism. So I never would have been. I would have considered working with companies, just like many of our students today. Being the interim president is a humbling experience. You get to look at a lot more things and see things a lot differently than you did before. But I also, I want to say something about my work life. So I had this political track, which since the 1970s I've been involved in reproductive rights. So you could also say that I too feel a crashing failure in terms of trying to. When I think back to the fact that legalizing abortion was supposed to be the floor and not the ceiling. So things have not gone in a really good direction in that regard. But on the other hand, as part of what I have been able to do with Hampshire as my political and personal and work home since 1985, was be part of founding, and it continues to grow, something called the National Network of Abortion Funds. And again, in terms of, there's a certain naivete about social change. So we founded the network in 1993 because there was no public funding for abortion had been lost. And but it was right when Clinton was elected, so we thought we were going to win it back through healthcare reform. But we needed like a little stopgap. So we needed to find the people in the country who would be interested in raising money and helping women who needed abortions and couldn't afford them, get them, just for the short term, just until we got that healthcare reform. So that has turned out to be a sort of lifelong pursuit, and things did not work out in the same way. But so I had this track of being political, and then my jobs were, my first teaching job was at the University of Missouri in St. Louis, and then I quickly went to Dartmouth College in the first year of coeducation. I actually knew Jeffrey's mother, who also worked there. But it was a kind of mean and ugly place for women in those days. There were 300 women students and 3,000 male students, and the college song, and I don't know if it's still the college song, was Men of Dartmouth. And no one thought they should get rid of it, even though they were not just men anymore. I then taught at Bentley College, which is in Waltham, Mass., which also had been an all-male institution, and was a business college. Bentley's motto is that Bentley means business, and they're not kidding. But I was in the philosophy department, so we created a little oasis. We actually developed a series of courses which we called Business Ethics, which was very hot then, colon. And then we were teaching feminism and Marxism, but they all had the tagline Business Ethics, which was really a wonderful thing. And it's a point about that you really need a posse, and partly when I got to Hampshire, I found out that there really was a big posse here. In terms of the, I kind of want to hold up this idea of what are your moments of hope and inspiration. I missed yesterday because I was at the national conference of the National Network of Abortion Funds in Chicago, and there we are. We're talking about the 30-plus year battle for public funding, and as we're there, people are tweeting and telling us about the more bad things that Congress is doing to take away reproductive rights and freedom. But it was very hopeful and inspiring, and to me, where I draw that in myself and the ability to keep going is from the fact that there are people who are not giving up, including myself. Because what would you do? I mean, it's sort of like once your eyes are open, and I think that was my political path. I went from being Betty Boop to a political activist because once I saw what was going on, I couldn't really just be, couldn't just put those little matching bows and outfits together anymore. I had to actually do something. And of course, that is what Hampshire is about. I think, secondly, I've done a lot of international work, and through something called the Women's Global Network for Reproductive Rights, and that has given me a great perspective. And again, because it's people who are doing things in really, we think we're just, and often Hampshire students think things are so awful here, so apathetic. And I've never been to a college and spoken where people don't tell me that. It's the worst place in the world. And so it's actually good to get out and to go see the rest of the world and to see what people are doing as activists with so much less in terms of resources and so much more in terms of oppression and repression. I also, for me, Hampshire has been a place of tremendous integrity. In 1995, as part of my position at the Civil Liberties Program, I was sued by one of these really evil anti-abortion people from Florida, who he'd been involved with two people who had murdered abortion providers, and it taught me a lot about Hampshire. I was sort of like, oh, Hampshire's just going to settle. They'll do anything to pay this guy off, and I was, carrying the flag and not get my own lawyer or whatever. And not only did Hampshire not settle, but this ultimately culminated in a 3-day trial in Northampton, and Greg Prince, who was then the president of Hampshire, came every day and sat in the courtroom with me to support me. So, there's a lot here to nurture. Somebody asked, how do you nurture or teach activism? And I think here at Hampshire, we do it both overtly. I mean, the Civil Liberties Program is both an academic and an activist program, and there's a lot of back and forth. It's not two separate tracks in the way that I had to put it together. I also think, to the person in the back, about the unity versus the many different, the divisions, that Hampshire really does teach you how to think and act holistically. It doesn't, the divisions aside, you pursue your education by pursuing a set of questions. And then you figure out what are all the things you need to know to answer those questions. And that is a very holistic and all too rare way of understanding what education is about. And I think a lot about also Hampshire continuing to be on the in the forefront of new ways of doing that. So there's some brochures around the room about the new Creativity Center, which is a way of helping people navigate the divisions, but not collapsing them, because what they need to know is actually in a lot of different places, or what they need in order to pursue it. So, I mean, I guess ultimately for me, Hampshire has been the place that has nurtured me as an activist for the last 26 years. And I think there's nothing more amazing. Melissa Beck is here. She was my first Division III student in 1987. She is a great activist in many different ways, and she's created her own organizations. And you know, Hampshire's just full of this, and you all know this because you've done the same things. So it's wonderful to be part of it, and to be able to know that you can keep on keeping on, and that there's a whole community that thinks that that's actually not just that you're not crazy, but it's the right thing to do. So I'll stop there.
Question before we
Sure.
get to some others. What percentage of what drives you is your hope that you can change things, and what percentage is anger? Just pisses you off because it's so wrong.
So I have a good friend, him probably, who's an Episcopal minister, but she's very cool. And you know, she always talks about anger is important because it fuels you, but then it burns hot and out. So I find that that's the balance. I mean, I'm angry all the time. You know, and I mean, I think that's in some ways that's the antidote to cynicism. Is that it still makes me angry that Congress is doing this or the legislature is doing that, but that's not enough to sustain activism. And I think it's not something I knew when I thought it was enough when I was in my 30s, late 20s, but I think over time it's not. And I think that our students here, I mean, and that's what somebody was saying after the panel before this, just brilliant panel with Hampshire alums who are doing amazing things, and finding ways to be positive affirmations of self and also be changing the world. So Beth's solar work and the work in art that people are doing, it's just, you know, terrific. Yeah. Hi.
Hi. I'm really curious to ask you guys, given what's happening now with Occupy, et cetera, I'm not sure how to phrase this. What if you could create an ideal situation where you could give advice, if there were leaders, and you could give advice on how to solve something or to actually achieve something, like something concrete, like let's say, for instance, Wall Street reform, okay? Like, whatever it is. What type of advice would you give to the non-existent but pretend leader of some sort of Occupy movement that wants to deal with Wall Street reform?
Share who you are and what year at Hampshire.
My name's Sandy, I'm Fall 87, and I'm a journalist based out of Montreal. Stumped you, right?
No,
we might have to caucus.
So what was wonderful about Occupy was they changed the conversation last fall, right? The whole conversation was about how we got to find ways to spend less money, and that the whole economy depended on cutting back on government, and that whether you agree with that or not, that conversation leads to a dead end in terms of changing the injustices that are affecting the country. And Occupy just wrenched it back to the question of fairness and the fact that the country's economy is stacked in favor of a very small group of people. And they didn't then say, therefore, you remember the scene, I don't know if you all love this movie as much as I do, the old version of A Christmas Carol, the black and white version, and it's after Scrooge has had his conversion, and he races in the morning after Christmas to be there before Bob Cratchit, and Bob Cratchit's late, and Scrooge is saying, Bob Cratchit, you're late, and sort of going on, and he says, and therefore, and it just sounds like it's coming, he's going to fire him, and I'm going to raise your salary, right? I mean, there was no and therefore. What's that about?
That's my point.
That was the part, I thought the anger would sort of drive us somewhere. You heard in my two stories, my organization looked for places where we could focus enough to have some control of who was in the discussion and some hope of an actual outcome, because we were all so pragmatic, we wanted to see something happen rather than being engaged in shouting at the injustice.
Do you want to address what she's saying?
I don't know, I'm not 100% certain, because my perspective of this has only been from seeing some viral videos, seeing something, the impression I've gotten of a lot of the Occupy movement. It's actually been something that's kept me personally from becoming more involved with it, is that I've had the impression that Occupy started off with the idea of wanting to have repercussions for people on Wall Street, and then essentially fractured itself into, or tried to start immediately stacking 30 or 40 different messages of this needs to be addressed, and this and this and this, every possible, trying to just focus on Wall Street, and these people are obscenely rich and they get it by taking it from everyone else, changing that message to every social justice message of the last 20 years, it seemed. And it seemed to be, it got to the point where it seemed like it was, just for some people, it was just a joke.
Right, so my question is really to people who've been around the activist movement, is like, if you could give advice to actually achieve something, as opposed to whining. And I agree, it's changed the dialogue, so it's ripe. Okay, so do something, therefore. So what advice might you give, given your experience, to potential make-believe leaders?
So we're actually not really in charge, Laura's in charge, and you're telling us that we can go till 4:05?
Yes.
Okay. That's good, sorry.
I'll just jump in, Sandy, briefly. For me, it brings up a conflict that I think is very immediate for all of us. In our lives with one another, we aspire to a form of dialogue and interaction that enables us to find mutually satisfactory resolutions to problems. If we're really good at working together, we do things that are consistent with our values, in which we treat one another humanely and find a win-win outcome. And in public life, that's all crap. You got to try to beat the hell out of the other side using any means you can, and the meaner you are right now, the more likely you are to win. And so your question creates conflicts for me about what I would recommend.
Well, I guess I wanted to say something. It also opened for me a different set of thinking, which is one of the themes that Jonathan talked about, which is the creating of space. So if I think about, well, what was Occupy? What did it really accomplish? It opened up an incredible space. I gave a talk at the Boston Occupy on reproductive justice and economic justice, and I realized it was a whole bunch of people who'd never thought about reproductive rights. So, you know, it just really, so there's opening space, and that's a lot of what I think about Hampshire and why it's such an incredibly important space, that you're creating the spaces for people to, and it's what your think tank did. You know, it's creating spaces for people to come together to do the things that will be revolutionary. I mean, that's, you know, there's a lot of thinking now about creativity, and that you create these spaces and you bring creative people together, and, you know, they don't even have to be working on the same thing, but they're like energized by each other's approach. So, you know, I would go more that way, and then say, you know, I mean, I wouldn't mind being locked in a room. My son got married last weekend. I was asked to give advice. I was so nervous, like, oh my God, you know, he never wants to listen to me. Whereas I would be delighted to give, you know, to give advice to a bunch of political leaders and tell them what to do. But I think that that's not exactly the point. Now, I saw Beth and somebody else in the middle. Yeah, so you two want to have your...
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on something positive. I had gone to a panel discussion yesterday on Occupy, and something I had brought up was I joined a credit union not long after, 2 months after the Occupy movement in New York City, or no, actually in San Francisco, and it's called New Resource Bank, and they're investing their money in environmentally and socially responsible places. So I found that interesting because of my own environmental ethics. But when I signed up, I said, you know, how are things going with this new bank? And they said over 900 people had signed up since the Occupy movement. And then seeing how social media was viral of everyone, friends from, you know, Hampshire alum and other folks saying, get out of these big corporate banks and join a local credit union. And that's really powerful and viral. And I don't know how many people switched their banks over in the last 7 months, but there's small examples like that kind of give hope of like, what did Occupy accomplish? But there are nuggets that I think we should tell those stories.
Yeah.
I think there's a curious, I don't know, to me, one of the things that was interesting in hearing the panel before you and Sandy's question is in 1972 when my class came to Hampshire, a lot of us were really angry at the system and wanted to change the system. And I think some people listen to Occupy and say they're against the system, they want to change the system. What I heard at the panel was the best way to change the system is individually by, you give the credit union example, but these structured ways where people can make a difference by focusing on, like you, Jonathan, on a targeted resolution of an issue instead of a global advice and solution that needs to move the needle so far one direction or another. And in that way, I think opening that space for the dialogue can give any number of us opportunities to deal with it on a local level or on a targeted basis, instead of trying to come up with this, give advice to who? Where there's so many different people sitting around the table that we may be able to agree on a few items, but if we start talking globally about what the issues are, even our best friends may disagree with us about significant issues, and we can still get things done.
And I think the getting done is really important. I mean, for me, the work with the abortion funds is about, you know, at the end of the day, last year 30,000 women got abortions who would not have gotten them. And you know, I need that. I know other things need to happen. I know that's not a solution, but I also need to feel like that I have some efficacy in this, which I think is also to Ben's question. Yes, 1, 2, 3.
I wanted to ask again a question that someone posed at the beginning of the session. Where do the two of you see Hampshire in 5 years?
Well, why don't we take off from where we are? So 2 different approaches to social change, but both lifelong commitments. Both of us feeling that Hampshire is a place where we're really comfortable about it because the school embraces it not just as something that's allowed to happen, but as a core part of our values. All of you reflect the fact that the education makes you highly entrepreneurial. And entrepreneurship is a big part of social change. The ability to confront and simply say, I can overcome obstacles, I will invent something to do this. If we could be defining ourselves as the school of entrepreneurship learning for social change, a clumsy expression. But the place where you can come and learn how to be a social entrepreneur, where you learn how to make a difference, which I think we are. I just don't think we define ourselves clearly enough and provide enough specific options for people. I don't think environmentally, we don't live up to our values yet, but we will. If when people are asked about Hampshire, everybody reacts that that's what's prominent about it, rather than remembering the Jimmy Fallon skit and talking about Halloween, we've made a huge leap. And then if in addition to that, we are a place that is creating new models for that kind of change, and embracing what all of you are doing and bringing it back in to fertilize the pedagogy, I think it's a very special place. And then I think we have a brand that differentiates us enough that we can survive the competitiveness of being a small liberal arts college without an endowment at the beginning of the 21st century, which ain't easy. We both have reasons to understand.
Well, I also think in terms of claiming Hampshire's leadership, is when you're sitting in the president's chair, you meet a lot of other college presidents. And even ones that are sort of on a values scale much more towards us than some others. The sense of the holistic understanding of education and the way that intersects with the entrepreneurial piece and the social justice piece is just enormously, this is what Hampshire has to bring to progressive education.
Yeah.
And so I think, in answer to that question, I want Hampshire to be seen as that, and in 5 years from now, I want people not to be wondering both of us, we think the question about Hampshire's future and sustainability is settled. If we didn't, we could not do the jobs that we have done. But I think there are others out there for whom it's not yet settled. And so I see the next 5 years as the period in which people will be convinced, where they will see that we will have the resources to do the things that are so important to putting us out in that leadership role, and to basically making us feel less precarious. And again, you can't do this job and feel like, oh my God, is it going to be precarious? How precarious is it? On the other hand, you have to understand how precarious it is, or you can't do the job. So there you have it.
Marlene, what you said about other college presidents, it's really true. I hadn't actually thought about this explicitly. Even schools that are very like us succumb to the temptation of generalized excellence. They just can't quite get themselves to say this is what we're about, because they want to be good at everything. And I think the way we are good at everything is by being about something.
So thank you all.